Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article on the fake Conqueror Gun Carriage by Mark Nash. Before we begin, we would like to thank our patrons for the support that makes what we do possible. The British FV-214 Conqueror heavy gun tank was developed in the early 1950s in answer to the increasingly hostile Soviet Union and its newly developed heavily armored tanks, such as the IS-3. The 120mm gun armed Conqueror was the first and last heavy gun tank produced and operated by the British Army. It had a short service life of just 11 years, from 1955 to 1966. While the Conqueror was based on a hull that was designed to be adaptable, no self-propelled gun was ever built using this hull. Decades later, the popular online game World of Tanks, published and developed by Wargaming, was preparing a new British tank line. Due to poor research, or possibly completely intentionally, the top of the artillery tech tree appeared as the Conqueror Gun Carriage, abbreviated GC, a completely fictional adaptation of the Conqueror chassis, which utilizes an archaic 9.2-inch siege gun placed in a fixed superstructure. That being said, elements of this tank did exist in one form or another. A small history is provided for this vehicle by Wargaming. A proposal to mount a 234mm howitzer on the chassis of the Conqueror. The power unit was placed in the front, existed only in blueprints. Despite not being given its fighting vehicle number, the Conqueror Gun Carriage is presented as being a vehicle of the FV-200 series produced in the early 1950s, in the early years of the Cold War. The FV-200s date back to the final stages of the Second World War, when the British War Office was looking for a universal tank. The ancestor of today's main battle tanks, the idea of the universal tank was that one chassis would spawn many variants, thus reducing costs, development, and simplifying maintenance. The first in the series was the FV-201. Despite a long development period, the FV-201 project was cancelled in 1949, with development moving on to the FV-214 Conqueror. As such, only 4 vehicles of the FV-200 series were ever produced and entered into service. These were the FV-214 Conqueror and FV-221 Carnarvon gun tanks, and the FV-219 and FV-222 Conqueror armored recovery vehicles. Self-propelled gun variants of the FV-200 were planned. These were based on the FV-201. The SPGs were designated the FV-206 and FV-207. The FV-206 was classified as self-propelled medium artillery, while the FV-207 was self-propelled heavy artillery. While it is unknown what gun the FV-206 would have used, it is known that the FV-207 was to mount a 155mm howitzer. Neither of these vehicles made it further than plans, and no drawings of them exist today. A representation of the FV-207 exists in World of Tanks, but as no official documents remain, it is hard to believe that this representation is in any way accurate. Neither the blueprints mentioned in Wargaming's claim to the historical accuracy of the vehicle, Conqueror Gun Carriage, nor this FV-207 have ever been publicly presented either. The FV-207 appears to be based solely on the real FV-3805 instead. Either way, there is no way to confuse the alleged and invented FV-207 with an even more invented Conqueror Gun Carriage. For much of the Cold War, the Royal Artillery, the part of the British Army responsible for this kind of vehicle, relied on one self-propelled gun, the FV-433 Abbott. The Abbott was built on the hull of the FV-432 armored personnel carrier and was equipped with a 105mm howitzer and a fully traversable turret. The Abbott appeared in the late 1950s, but before this was in development, there were experiments with other self-propelled gun designs. After the Second World War, the United Kingdom was still using the Sexton as its primary self-propelled gun. A long development program was launched to find a replacement, and while ultimately resulting in the Abbott, other vehicles also went through development. The design that came closest to completion was the BL 5.5-inch howitzer-armed FV-3805, which was based on the Centurion. While this made it to prototype trials, it never entered service. The Abbott would serve as the UK's frontline self-propelled gun until the early 1990s, when it was finally replaced by the 155mm gun-armed AS-90. Gun carriage is a uniquely British term used to describe self-propelled guns. Although the fake one is labeled as being based on the FV-214 Conqueror, the layout of the hull suggests that it is actually based on the FV-215. The FV-215 never entered service, but it was designed to be the Conqueror's replacement, and while sharing many components, had a narrower hull, a rear-mounted turret, and a centrally mounted engine. This layout is shared by the fake GC, with a fixed fighting compartment at the rear and a centrally mounted engine. The fixed compartment, or casemate, holds the 9.2-inch main armament. The design of the compartment seems to take a lot of cues from the FV-3805, featuring the same cylindrical, limited traverse turret and a similar layout of periscopes, sights, and hatches. There's also a large hatch and a recoil spade installed in the rear of the vehicle. Real self-propelled guns, as they are operated in pre-arranged fixed positions, usually operate with a large rear hatch or tailgate open. It provides easy access for resupplying ammunition during a fire mission, and also, being open to the elements, provides ventilation by letting smoke and fumes from the gun escape. The spade is used to transfer recoil forces from the chassis directly to the ground, easing the strain on the suspension. When the vehicle was in position, it would be lowered to the ground. When the gun is fired, the spade provides a backstop by digging into the ground. Armor on the hull is listed as 133 mm for the front of the hull, 50.8 mm or 2 inches on the sides, and 76.2 mm or 3 inches on the rear. This is not too far off the armor thickness of the Conqueror. However, it is tricky to pinpoint the exact thickness of the hull armor due to conflicting sources. The upper hull was between 120 and 130 mm thick, sloped at 61.5 degrees from vertical. This would give an effective thickness of either 289 mm to 313 mm. Side armor was 2 inches or 51 mm thick. This is not the same for the more similar FV-215, however, with planned thicknesses of 125 mm sloped at 59 degrees on the upper glasses, and just 1 3/4 inches, 44.5 mm, on the sides and rear. The crew is also closer to the FV-215, being made up of a 5-man team. This consists of the commander, gunner, driver, and 2 loaders. It must be said, though, that 2 loaders would be expected in a vehicle such as this due to the scale of the ordnance. As with all FV-200s, the driver of this fake self-propelled gun sits on the front right of the hull. Despite the close similarity to the FV-215, which would have used a rover engine, this fictional self-propelled gun is listed as having the same engine as the Conqueror, consisting of the Rolls-Royce Meteor M120. This was a water-cooled petrol injection engine developing 810 horsepower at 2800 RPM. It was a derivative of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, famous for powering the British Spitfire and American Mustang fighter aircraft of World War II. In-game, this propels the self-propelled gun to a top speed of 34.3 km per hour forwards and 10 km per hour in reverse. The horseman suspension of the gun carriage is one of the accurate parts of the vehicle. On the FV-200s, the suspension system had 2 wheels per bogie unit. The wheels would be made of steel, measuring approximately 20 inches in diameter, and constructed from 3 separate parts. These consisted of an outer and inner half with a steel rim in contact with the track. Between each layer was a rubber ring. The horseman system consisted of 3 horizontal springs mounted concentrically, guided by an internal rod and tube. This allowed each wheel to rise and fall independently, although the system did struggle when both wheels rose at the same time. 4 bogies lined each side of the hull of the vehicle, giving it 8 road wheels per side. There would also be 4 return rollers, 1 per bogie. The drive sprockets were relocated at the rear of the running gear, with the idler wheel at the front. One of the most illogical choices in the design of the spurious gun carriage is its armament, consisting of the BL 9.2-inch howitzer Mark II. The BL, standing for breech loading, 9.2-inch howitzer was a heavy siege howitzer developed in 1913 and would see service in the Royal Artillery in the First World War as a counter-battery weapon. In its day, this howitzer was an extremely powerful weapon, firing a high-explosive shell that weighed up to 290 pounds. These shells could vary from 28 to 32 inches long, with a high-explosive payload of either amytal, lyddite, or trotol, weighing anywhere from 25 to 40 pounds. There were 2 versions of the 9.2-inch howitzer, the Mark I and the Mark II. It is the Mark II that was chosen for this fake self-propelled gun. With the 13-foot, 3-inch barrel, the Mark II appeared in late 1916 in response to a request for greater range. The Mark I had a range of 5.7 miles, while the Mark II had an increased range of 7.9 miles, with a muzzle velocity of 1,600 feet per second. The complete gun weighed around 6 long tons and had a maximum elevation of 55 degrees. The in-game depiction limits it to only 45 degrees, probably due to internal space limitations. On this fake self-propelled gun, the gun is mounted in a thinly armored cylindrical housing known as a limited traverse turret. This gives it a horizontal traverse arc of 60 degrees. The exposed parts of the gun, such as the recoil buffer, are also covered in a representation of protective armor. Just over 500 BL 9.2-inch howitzers were produced. While there is no question that it was a powerful weapon, the howitzer would have been completely obsolete in the early Cold War era that this vehicle is set in. The weapon was officially retired during the Second World War and was replaced by much more accurate and advanced weaponry. The Conqueror Gun Carriage is, without doubt, a fake vehicle. It is not the worst of Wargaming's fake tank crimes, as at least a few of the components used in its design did exist in one form or another. In reality, there would not have been a need for this gun carriage. Had there been a need, it is highly unlikely that designers would turn to an almost antique weapon to arm it, especially as the gun was officially retired 10 years before this vehicle would have existed. That is all for this article. Please check back to our website, where we will be posting new articles on the regular. If you would like to support the work we do, please consider subscribing or donating through PayPal or Patreon. To keep up with the articles we post, you can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, and our community Discord channel. Until next time, keep us in your sights.